Unsolved, no more. The serial killer finally caught by DNA. Before you go, subscribe for more gripping crime stories, like for answers, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into true crime together. It was a hot July afternoon in 2010 when detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department pulled up outside a modest yellow house on West 81st Street. The street was quiet, lined with palm trees and old cars. But behind that calm exterior, something dark was about to unravel. Inside that home lived a man who, for 25 years, had blended perfectly into the neighborhood. A husband, a father, a friend. His name was Lonnie Franklin Jr., and that afternoon, his double life was finally coming to an end. Police moved fast. They had spent weeks building up to this moment. A new DNA match, something they never thought possible, had linked Franklin to a string of murders stretching back decades. When they burst through the front door, Franklin stood frozen in his living room, TV remote in hand, as officers shouted for him to get on the ground. The neighbors peeked through their windows, confused. They had known Lonnie as the quiet guy who fixed cars and waved good morning. None of them could imagine the horrors buried in his past. Detectives searched his home, and what they found made seasoned officers sick to their stomachs. Hidden behind the walls and stuffed in old shoeboxes were hundreds of photographs of women, some smiling, some asleep, some clearly lifeless. Many of them were never identified. These images hinted at something far worse than anyone had expected. This wasn't a one-time killer. This was a man who had hunted for decades, killing and disappearing between each strike. The story, as investigators would learn, began long before that day. Back in the mid-1980s, South Central Los Angeles was drowning in crime, drugs, and fear. Young women, mostly or many struggling with addiction, started vanishing. Then, bodies began turning up in alleys, dumpsters, and abandoned lots. Each time, the victims were found shot or strangled, their bodies discarded like trash. Police called it the work of a predator, but no one could catch him. As the years passed, the killings stopped. 10 years went by. Silence. People thought the monster was gone. Then, without warning, the murders started again in 2002. The press called him the Grim Sleeper, the killer who disappeared, then woke up to kill once more. Now, in 2010, with Franklin in custody, detectives believed they finally had their man. But as they opened his garage and lifted a heavy tarp covering an old freezer, the air froze. Inside lay something that would make this case even darker than anyone imagined. And what they found beneath that tarp would change the investigation forever. When detectives lifted the tarp inside Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s garage, they expected old car parts or junk, not what they saw next. Beneath the cover was a collection of women's clothing, jewelry, and Polaroid photos, carefully arranged in small boxes like trophies. Each item represented someone's daughter, sister, or mother, victims whose names had long faded from police reports. Detective Dennis Kilcoyne, one of the lead investigators, described it as stepping into a silent graveyard. Every photograph was evidence of another life cut short, another story that never got closure. Some photos dated back to 1985, others to 2007, proving that Franklin had been active for more than 2 decades. It was no coincidence. This was the very heart of South Central's most terrifying mystery. But what puzzled investigators most wasn't just the number of victims. It was the 10-year gap between murders. Why did the killings stop? And what made him start again? Detectives believed Franklin had stopped because of guilt. He stopped because he got comfortable. He thought he'd beaten the system. And in a way, he had, until science caught up. Back in 2008, cold case detectives began using a new technology, familial DNA testing. It allowed them to look not for the killer himself, but for anyone related to him. That's when everything changed. In 2010, a partial match popped up. A young man arrested on a weapons charge. The DNA was close, but not exact. Investigators realized it wasn't their suspect, but his father. That's how Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man who had never even been on their radar, suddenly became the prime suspect. Detectives secretly followed Franklin, watching his every move. They needed a confirmed DNA sample to prove he was the one. One afternoon, while Franklin ate pizza at a local restaurant, an undercover officer posing as a waiter collected his discarded utensils and a half-eaten slice. that pizza crust would solve one of Los Angeles' longest and darkest mysteries. When the lab results came back, the DNA was a perfect match. The same genetic fingerprint found on multiple victims' bodies over 25 years. That single test shattered decades of doubt. The media exploded. Headlines screamed across the country. Grim sleeper caught after 25 years. Families of victims flooded the police station, some crying, some furious, demanding answers. But as the evidence poured in, one thing became clear. There were far more victims than anyone had imagined. And then, during a late-night evidence review, detectives uncovered a final clue, one that suggested the nightmare wasn't over yet. Because one of the women in Franklin's photos was still alive. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation room. A woman believed to be dead, a face found among dozens of haunting Polaroids, was alive. Detectives immediately launched a quiet search to find her, hoping she could be the key to unlocking Franklin's darkest secrets. After combing through old missing persons files and cross-referencing fingerprints, they found her, Nietra, Washington. She was the one who got away. In 1988, Nietra had been shot in the chest and brutally assaulted before being pushed out of a car and left for dead. Miraculously, she survived. At the time, her attacker was described as a polite man driving an orange Ford Pinto who'd offered her a ride. She remembered his calm voice, his glasses, his fatherly smile, and the instant it all turned to terror. For over 2 decades, her case was forgotten, buried beneath the weight of dozens of other unsolved murders. But now, as she sat across from detectives, she finally gave a name to the face that haunted her nightmares, Lonnie Franklin Jr. With Nietra's testimony and DNA evidence, the prosecution built an ironclad case. Police began uncovering more evidence inside Franklin's home: photographs, bullets, even small trinkets belonging to missing women. Every corner of his house told a story of control and cruelty hidden behind the walls of an ordinary life. Neighbors who'd known him for years were stunned. He fixed cars. He helped people, one said. We never imagined this. When the trial began in 2016, the courtroom was filled with grief, rage, and relief. Families of victims packed the benches, clutching faded photos of daughters they hadn't seen in decades. Franklin sat motionless, expressionless, as the prosecution showed the jury his trophies, the images, the souvenirs, the evidence that left no room for doubt. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. After months of testimony, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. 11 murders confirmed, though investigators believed the real number could be far higher. Franklin was sentenced to death, bringing closure to families who had lived in pain for half their lives. But justice came quietly. In 2020, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found dead in his prison cell, the cause never officially revealed. Some called it karma, others a mystery. What everyone agreed on was this: science caught what evil thought it could hide forever. For 25 years, the grim sleeper walked among them, smiling, helping, blending in. And yet, a single strand of DNA proved what no one could see: that monsters sometimes live right next door,